The first song in that third block, the block that's about death and about what hope, if any, there is in that, is called King Park, and it is the story aspect of it is essentially a retelling of an instance that happened in Grand Rapids not terribly long ago, year and a half, maybe 2 years ago. Brad and I work in a hardware store. Our parents were cousins, and our parents own a hardware store, and our grandparents before had owned it. It's just like a local neighborhood hardware store, family run, and it's kind of in the rough part of Grand Rapids, in southeast side Grand Rapids. And in the last couple years, there have been a higher frequency of shootings than the last, I think, 10 years before. I don't know the exact numbers, but there's been a lot of gang violence, and it's something that we've witnessed not firsthand, but when something like that happens, blocks away from where you work, and when you're, helping people from the community every day, and you have all these, regular customers and friends that have been coming in for years and years and years that are all a part of this community, you become a part of the community itself, and you kind of feel these shockwaves when it happens. So there's one in particular that really struck me, and I think really struck the community in general. And what happened was there was a kid who had gotten off the bus and was walking with some friends home after school. And the friends that he was with were gang affiliated. And the rival gang knew that they were going to be getting off the bus at this time, and they planned to drive by. And they drove by and fired a few shots, and the only one that hit anyone was one that struck the kid who wasn't gang affiliated, who was just walking with friends. It hit him in the neck and killed him. The person who fired the shot fled the scene, and it came out that the kid who was killed, who's, 15 or 16, I can't remember exactly, was a lady I work with's best friend's kid. So it kind of hit closer to home than any of the other shootings had. I talk about one of these shootings on the last record, the last Lost Continent, when I talk about I still see him dead in the parking lot at the gas station just down the street, is another shooting that happened a few years ago, right nearby where this one was. So that, like I said, this kind of hit closer to home, and there was like 3 days where it kind of died down, and the person who had fired the shots and had killed the kid had been identified. Like, people knew who he was, and the cops were just looking for him, and people were, asking around, and no one heard anything for like 3 days. And then one day when we were at work, we found out that they had found this guy, and he was staying in a hotel kind of on the opposite side of town. Somebody at the hotel had seen him and had recognized him and called the police, and they showed up, and they arrested somebody who was staying with him, another gang member, and then he fled and got away and ran up to the room where he was staying and locked himself in the room with a gun and was threatening to kill himself. And as best I know, obviously I wasn't there, was that the kid's uncle was, and this is a kid, and I think, and one of the things I mentioned in the song that I think is most poignant is that the kid who shot the other kid was 20, maybe 21, and they called him Grandpa because he was older than the rest of the kids in the gang. Like, he's younger than I am, and he's firing a weapon from a moving vehicle. Anyway, but his uncle came to the scene and tried to talk him out of shooting himself, and he asked his uncle whether or not he would get into heaven if he killed himself, and then did. So it was kind of this, like, what was already a heartbreaking story became like even more overwhelming for everyone, because it wasn't, it was two children who didn't need to die. It was this very, like, senseless on every level situation, and obviously, like, I don't know, it was a lot to take in, and it's still a lot to take in. It's still a lot to think about and try to make sense of. And the song itself kind of covers a lot of ground, and obviously the story aspect of it pretty closely dictates those events. Like, it starts off talking about the shooting itself, and then it goes to the people in the neighborhood coming out of their houses and surrounding the crime scene, and, like, talks about all the gossip and the rumors and how it was just, like, what everyone was talking about. And then it talks about the funeral, and then it tells the conclusion. It talks about how he was identified, and it talks about where they found him, and it goes through that last conversation between him and his uncle. And then the author's voice is kind of interwoven between that. And in some ways, I think it's the most me that any of the monologues are. The most, I don't know. What the second voice accomplishes is I'm trying to think of the right way to word it, but it kind of imagines what it would have been like to really be there in all of those situations, to really, like I said earlier, how overwhelming it was at the time for everybody involved and for everybody even in close proximity to digest and make sense of the tragedy, and how overwhelming it still is to me today, years later, and mostly, unaffected. It wasn't someone I knew that got killed or that killed himself, but it's still been difficult for me to really fully process. And the second voice in the song, and the author's voice, is essentially wondering whether or not being closer to the situation would have really framed it, put it into perspective, and really made a complete picture out of it, I guess. I don't know. It's hard for me to pinpoint exactly, but the voice kind of imagines, like, it's a flashback. It's like he floats back in time and is this ethereal entity, this spirit at the scene of the crime, and is able to go in and see everything, and to, go see the kid lying on the ground, to be there when the shots are fired, to see his mother, to see his family members, and then to hear the conversations going on around, to be able to float in between the people out on their porch or out in their front yard and hear what they're saying, and to be able to go backwards and see them when they were younger, to see them as children, and to try to kind of sort out how something like that happens. Because that's the thing that I think is the most confusing to everybody involved, is like, how does this happen? How do we get to this point? One of the things that's so poignant to me is that it's such a deliberate action to pull the trigger of a gun, to point a gun at someone and to pull that trigger, and to do that, but not fully understand the consequence of your action until you're holed up in a hotel with the police outside and you have a gun to your head. And then you're the child that you killed. You are reduced to your most basic elements. And how do you get to that point? And it's a very, very complicated. And the other thing is that it's kind of a commentary on songwriting and on approaching these stories. For me, the first instance I had with writing about anyone else was on Somewhere, the 3 songs about divorce. That was the first time that I'd ever really approached something that wasn't a very personal situation or conflict. And it was a really difficult experience for me to approach someone else's tragedy, because you want to do it justice. You want to make sure everything's right. You want to think about everything, because it's so much more devastating to make a mistake when talking about someone else than it is when you're talking about yourself. I'm the only victim if I say something wrong or if I make the wrong thing come across. But when you're writing about someone else, it's so delicate, because you're not the only one that suffers the consequences. Even if they don't know it, like, you still want to make that come across the right way. You want to cover everything. And when I decided to write about this story, when I decided to tell, or when I decided what King Park would be about, that was something I had to think about. Like, how do I really do this justice? How do I really cover every angle? And that was part of the whole, like, floating in and out of the scenes and being in the place at the time of the crime, which is what you're kind of forced to do in trying to capture something properly, is you kind of have to put yourself at the scene of the crime in a way. The other thing that was very frustrating to me and to everyone in the community and in the hardware store we work is how it was handled by the media, and how that area of our city has been villainized by sensational local news, and how little of an understanding people really have about it. And it's a predominantly impoverished and predominantly African-American community, and to see the way that situation that was so close to home and so is heartbreaking, to see it dehumanized and turned into a news story for the upper middle class, white, suburban, whatever, to digest is awful. It was just really, really sad to see how people represented that, and how there's still such a double standard. Like, you hear about, some white guy in Wayland, Michigan killed his family, and people still visit Wayland, and then you read on the internet, on these local news websites, about the shooting in Southeast Side Grand Rapids, and it becomes a black and white thing. And to see the way that both sides are, each story is told differently from the other, and then to see the difference in reaction, where, like, nobody, like, everybody, Southeast Side Grand Rapids, like, a bunch of, gang kids killing a bunch of gang kids, like, what's new? And nobody bats an eyelash at guy in Wayland killing his family. And just to be able to see that double standard firsthand, and to see that we haven't really fix that problem. And we might not ever. It's just really discouraging. So the song's about a lot of different things. Kind of stems from the shooting itself. And the things that people choose to blame, and that's another thing about just like the media coverage. Like it becomes so dehumanized. You're talking about numbers and statistics, and you're talking about, oh, is this drug, and this is the problem. But there's never even a pause to just like mourn the situation, regardless of cause and effect. These are two kids that died. It's too much of a tragedy for any one person to really fully understand.